I learned the power of silence the day I stopped begging to be understood. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the air feels heavy before anything bad happens. The kettle was screaming on the stove, and I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small could make so much noise. That's when my phone buzzed. A message. Just one sentence. Accusatory. Sharp. Unfair. Are you going to apologize, or do you really think you're right? I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering, heart pounding like I'd been caught doing something wrong. For most of my life, I would have rushed to explain myself. I was raised to smooth things over, to keep the peace, even when it cost me my dignity. I was the one who said sorry just to end the tension. Sorry for speaking up. Sorry for setting boundaries. Sorry for telling the truth. But that morning, something inside me resisted. Before all the conflict, my life was simple in a quiet way. I worked hard, kept my circle small, and believed that being good meant being agreeable. I was the dependable one, the listener, the fixer. At family dinners, I passed the salt, laughed at jokes that stung, and swallowed my opinions with dry bread and overcooked chicken. Peace, I told myself, was worth the discomfort. Then came the slow shift, a disagreement at work where I was blamed for a mistake I didn't make, a family argument where my words were twisted, a friendship where honesty was labeled as betrayal. Each time the expectation was the same: apologize and move on. That message on my phone wasn't really about that moment, it was about a lifetime of conditioning. And for the first time, I thought of something I once read about Alexander the Great, that he never apologized for standing in his truth, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. He knew when an apology was wisdom, and when it was surrender. I set the phone down, the kettle clicked off, and in that silence, I made a decision that would change how people treated me forever.
The first real test came sooner than I expected. At work, there was a meeting that stretched longer than it should have. The conference room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and dry markers, and everyone looked tired, irritated in that quiet, professional way. When the project delays came up, my manager cleared his throat and looked straight at me. "I think we all know where this fell apart," he said gently, but not kindly. I felt that old reflex rise in my chest, the instinct to apologize first and sort out the truth later. My mouth almost formed the word, almost, but something in his tone didn't sit right. I replayed the emails in my head, the timelines, the approvals I never received. This wasn't confusion, it was convenience. I asked a simple question instead. "Can we pull up the approval dates?" The room went quiet, papers shuffled, someone coughed. When the dates appeared on the screen, the truth sat there plain as daylight. The delay hadn't been mine. My manager nodded slowly. "All right, let's move on." No apology to me, no acknowledgement, just move on. After the meeting, a coworker pulled me aside. "You could have just said sorry and avoided all that," she whispered, like she was offering advice instead of a warning. That's when I understood the first situation smart people never apologize in, when the blame isn't theirs to carry. An apology wouldn't have bought peace, it would have bought permission for it to happen again. The second situation revealed itself at home. A family disagreement that started over something small, holiday plans, I think, turned sharp when I set a boundary. My sister accused me of being selfish. My mother went quiet, the way she always did when she expected me to fold. "Say sorry," my sister said. "You're upsetting everyone." But I wasn't yelling, I wasn't cruel, I was honest. And for once, I didn't apologize for choosing myself. The room stayed tense, thick with disappointment, but beneath it there was something new. Respect. Not spoken, not admitted, but felt. That was when I realized apologies lose their power when they're demanded instead of earned. And there was still one situation left, one that hurt the most to learn. The third situation found me in a place I didn't expect, inside a friendship I had held onto for far too long. We'd known each other for years, shared birthdays, long phone calls, secrets whispered over late-night tea. She knew my history, my soft spots, the places where I bent too easily. And maybe that was why it hurt more when the pattern repeated itself. Her sharp words followed by my familiar apology. This time, the argument was quiet. No raised voices, just a look she gave me, tired and dismissive. "You've changed," she said. "You used to be easier." Easier. The word landed heavy. What she meant was easier to interrupt, easier to dismiss, easier to guilt into saying sorry. "I don't think I did anything wrong," I said carefully. She laughed, short and humorless. "So you're not going to apologize?" In that moment, I felt the weight of every past apology I'd offered just to keep her close. I thought of Alexander the Great again, not the conqueror, but the man who understood loyalty. He didn't apologize to those who benefited from his self-doubt. He chose clarity over comfort. "I'm not," I said.
The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was final. That friendship ended not with a fight, but with distance. Messages slowed, invitations stopped, and while there was grief in that loss, there was also relief, because the third situation smart people never apologize in is when an apology would cost them their self-respect. Walking away wasn't easy. Some nights I replayed the conversation, wondering if I should have softened my words, but every time I imagined saying sorry, my chest tightened. It would have been a lie. Over time, something shifted. People stopped assuming I'd fold. Conversations changed. Accusations softened into questions, and those who only stayed because I apologized for existing quietly disappeared. That's the thing no one tells you. Not apologizing doesn't make you cruel, it makes you clear. And clarity, I learned, has a way of rearranging your life.
The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came slowly, like a tide I hadn't been watching. At first, there was discomfort. People looked at me differently, measured their words, tested my responses. Some conversations grew awkward, others surprisingly honest. I noticed how often silence followed my refusal to apologize, as if people were waiting for the old version of me to step back in and smooth things over. At a family gathering weeks later, my aunt pulled me aside in the kitchen. The smell of fried onions hung in the air, and the radio hummed low in the background. "You've become distant," she said. "People think you're cold now." I wiped my hands on a dish towel and met her eyes. "I'm not cold. I'm just not explaining myself anymore." She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, like something clicked. That was when I understood the public consequence of standing firm. Some people will misunderstand you because they benefited from you being smaller, and they'll call your growth a flaw. But something else happened too. At work, I was invited into decisions instead of blamed after the fact. At home, my boundaries stopped being treated like inconveniences. Even my mother, who once waited for me to apologize just to restore peace, began asking, "How do you feel about this?" instead of telling me what would be easiest. The world didn't fall apart because I withheld apologies. It adjusted. I thought again of Alexander the Great, not as a ruler, but as a mindset. He didn't lead by constantly correcting himself to make others comfortable. He led by knowing when humility served growth and when it served manipulation. Apologies, I learned, are powerful only when they're honest, when they come from reflection, not fear, when they repair harm, not reinforce imbalance. There were moments I still wanted to say sorry out of habit, out of exhaustion, but each time I paused, breathed, and asked myself one question: did I actually do something wrong? If the answer was no, I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, I found something steadier than approval. I found self-respect. Healing didn't look like triumph. It looked like smaller moments, barely noticeable if you weren't paying attention. It was the way my shoulders stopped tensing when my phone buzzed, the way I no longer rehearsed apologies in my head before difficult conversations. I began listening differently, not for cues to fix things, but for truth. Mine, theirs, the space between. One evening, I caught my reflection in the window while washing dishes. The kitchen light cast a soft glow, and for a second, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because I felt settled, grounded, like I wasn't bracing for impact anymore. That's when it hit me. For years, I'd been apologizing to survive, to stay included, to avoid conflict. But survival isn't the same as living. I started teaching this lesson quietly, by example. When a younger coworker came to me, shaken after being blamed unfairly, I didn't tell her what to say. I asked her what was true. When a family member pushed for an apology I didn't owe, I stayed calm, respectful, and unmoved. Not everyone liked it. Some never will, and that's a cost I had to accept. Alexander the Great once said he would rather live a short life of glory than a long one of obscurity. I understand that differently now. Glory isn't conquest, it's integrity. It's knowing when to bow your head and when to stand still and let the storm pass around you. Smart people don't avoid apologies. They honor them. They save them for the moments that matter, when harm is real, when accountability leads to growth. Because an apology given too freely loses its meaning, but one given with intention, that can change everything. I didn't become harder, I became clearer. And clarity, I've learned, is the kindest thing you can offer, to others and to yourself. These days, when I think about apologies, I think about weight. I think about how heavy they felt when I carried them for everyone else, and how light I felt when I finally put down the ones that were never mine to hold. There is wisdom in saying I'm sorry, real wisdom, but there's also wisdom in restraint. In knowing that your silence can sometimes speak louder than any explanation, that your dignity does not need permission to exist.
Alexander the Great's mindset wasn't about pride. It was about discernment, about understanding that leadership, over others or over your own life, requires clarity. You don't apologize for telling the truth. You don't apologize for setting boundaries. And you don't apologize to those who mistake your kindness for weakness. If this story reached you, maybe it's because you're standing at that same quiet crossroads, the phone in your hand, the knot in your chest, wondering whether peace is worth the cost of self-betrayal. So let me ask you, gently, have you ever apologized for something you didn't do just to keep the peace? If you have, you're not alone, and if you're learning to stop, I see you. If this story gave you something to think about, consider supporting the channel by liking, subscribing, or sharing it with someone who needs to hear it today. Sometimes the right story at the right time can change how we show up in the world. Thank you for listening.